Can you guys all hear me? Yes. All right, awesome. I don't want to be next to the mic. I think I can project. So my name is Hector Terrero. I was actually born here in the Dominican Republic, in actually Los Minas. Anybody from Los Minas here? Yeah, there you go. Los Tres Brazos, to be more specific. Por Moisés. I moved to New York when I was 10 years old. And in New York, I grew up in New York City, Manhattan, Washington Heights, like most Dominicans. And yeah, unfortunately. But it raised me in an environment. Oh, there you go. We have awesome, great, dope. Thank you. I don't have to scream anymore. So yeah, grew up in Washington Heights, New York City, and went to college in New York. And then right after college, I was hired by Apple. I actually studied mechanical engineer in college, and I worked at Apple as a mechanical engineer for 4.5 years, I think. I worked in the development team designing the Apple Watch. So I think the one that's coming up sometime soon, hopefully, was the last watch that I worked on. But then I've been doing software development for about 4 years now. Been hosting mentorship programs and mentoring people, and eventually decided to do this full time. So now I'm a software engineer at Apple. More specifically, I'm an accessibility lead software engineer. So how many of you guys know what accessibility is? Okay, good. A few people. That's good. So that you guys are going to make my job not so hard then. Today's session, we're going to talk about UX engineering. And just right before this section, there was another session about UX, right, which is great. So I love that we're having the conversation about UX, user experience design, user experience engineering. Those two are kind of very similar, and you see how they kind of are intertwined. But we're going to talk about equity and inclusion. How many of you guys know what equity is? Good. Because that means I did my homework and we're learning something today, okay? And how many of you guys know what inclusion is? All right, so let's talk about it. Let's get started. All right, so the first thing I want to tell you about is accessibility. So what is accessibility? Well, I'll tell you what it's not. Accessibility is not about making a product accessible to people with disability. Right? The first thing that happens when we talk about accessibility is that very often we think about people who are handicapped, they're missing a leg, or they're deaf, hard of hearing, or they're blind. And we think about how can we make products accessible to those people. And we often think about that as accessibility. Well, I want to change the way you think about accessibility slightly. I want you to think about accessibility from a different perspective. Think about abilities. We are humans. We look different. We do different things, we like different things, and some of us have different abilities, right? So disability is sort of like a negative connotation to think about somebody lesser than us or less capable than us, and that's usually not the case. So my job at Apple is to ensure that when we design applications, that we make them accessible to everybody. And independent of what walk of life you are, whether you read with your hands or with your eyes, whether you hear with your mouth or with your ears, my job is to make sure that whenever we design iOS applications, that anybody can use those applications. And the intent is accessibility means let's make an application that just works for everybody. All right? So that's how we define accessibility. So a few disclaimers today. I, Hector Terrero, do not speak or intend to speak on behalf of my employer. That's very important, all right? Very important that I do that. Unfortunately, I work for a company that is very protective about the brand. And they just don't like people going out there and speaking about the brand. And so I'm not here to speak on behalf of my employer. I'm here to speak on behalf of me. Now, they don't own me. I own myself, and I own my own talent, so I can speak about myself. All right? So that's the first part. The second part is that I do not claim to own any of the knowledge I'll be sharing with you today. All right? It's not mine. I didn't own it. I didn't design it. I didn't discover it. I'm just here to share it. I found it. I did some research, and I was like, you know what? This is super cool. I want to share it with people. All right? And everything that I'll share today is a collective of my past experience as an engineer, a researcher, and the intersectionality of my identity. And what does that mean? Well, let's take a quick route. So before we get started, let's get some definition out of the way, right? So how many of you guys know what a UX engineer is? I really like this, right? Because it's like, we actually are going to do some work today. All right, so UX engineer. They are creative all-arounders. They bring a balance of design savvy and technical expertise. As thoughtful problem solvers, they apply their unique crossover skill sets to product across all stages of creation, from intent to actual production. And what that means is that a UX engineer is somebody who understands design, understands pain points, the user and their problems, and has a technical background to help in the problem solving. So UX engineers, they get kicked off very early in the design phase. So when we are at work, when we're thinking about what this app is going to look like, we all sit in a room, and I'm part of that conversation. Because when the UX designer is thinking about an experience, I have to provide my input on whether we can actually code that. And that's very important, because what happens is, the inversely of UX design effect is that sometimes we have these very big moonshots. And moonshots is you have some designers that just be like, hey, can we make this phone fly? And have the person grow wings, right? And at the end of the day, we're limited by frameworks and APIs and all this good stuff. So UX engineers are just well-rounded individuals who understand how to solve problems from a technical perspective, and they understand what's feasible. And the big keynote question here is they understand what's feasible and what we can do with whatever we got in our hand. The next big word that most of you guys don't know, that I think is the most important one today, and I really hope that you guys can take this one home with you, is equity. Most people define equity as your ownership in a company. That's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to talk about equity from a different perspective. It is the absence of avoidable and remediable difference among groups of people, whether those groups are defined by socially, economically, or demographically, or geographically. Equity is the intent to create a level playing field for everybody, independent of where they come from. What that means is that it is our responsibility building technology to ensure that if somebody cannot read, that they can still use the app. That if somebody doesn't speak a given language, that somehow we make the app localizable enough so that other can understand. What we understand with equity is that we're not all given or born with the same set of privileges, but we're all running the same race. And it's a little bit unfair for some of us who weren't born to great dads and moms with deep pockets to pay our very private education. And so some of us has to get scholarship to go study abroad. Some of us has to work twice as hard to get half as far. And so in order for us to avoid the burnout that happens from people overworking themselves to meet everybody else halfway, well, some of us in position of privilege need to think about equity and how we add equity into the things that we do, like our products. And what I'm really interested to tell you about today is how you, as a software engineer, can be part of the difference to add equity in the Dominican Republic, to ensure that users who use your platforms have the same level of access, but the same level of privilege as everybody else who might have an iPhone, but your friend over here has an Android, right? And that those remediable differences, they are differences, but they are avoidable. You can prevent those differences from happening. And that's what equity is. It is your responsibility, it is our responsibility to make sure that those differences don't happen, all right? But when we think about equity, it goes hand in hand with historically marginalized community. What does that mean? Who has, and maybe this is a personal question, but who have used banking account here, digital banking? So, transferencia, all right. I think in the last session, we talked about how we're forced to use this app because sometimes your payroll is attached to whatever the banking system is. And I'm telling you right now, these apps suck. Like, they're really, really, really bad. But I'll tell you something more importantly. I still don't have a bank account here. And I've been trying for about a year. And I've been refused to be given a bank account in the Dominican Republic because I don't have formal employment in the Dominican Republic, right? But it is my money. And anybody in America will bend over many times to get my money in their banks. But it's like here, they don't want it. And so in the financial industry here, or the fintech, there had been a particular set of group of people that had been underrepresented when building products in the financial market. And we call those the underbanked. All right? So equity is us building software that enables people without bank accounts to actually have, in fact, bank accounts. And we build product for a historically marginalized community, people who have been oppressed by the system, discrimination, among other things. All right? Inclusive development, right? This is another part. Developing in a way that draws the full range of human diversity. This one is kind of straightforward. If you look around, we all look different, right? Very important. I mean, I don't look like you don't look like me, right? So it's very important that as a software engineer, when we think about our personas, right, those personas we get from whether UX team or the product team, that those personas actually represent the community that we actually live in. And sometimes they don't. Trust me. Like the way I look at these apps out here, it almost seems like they have a very specific kind of target, and it's not any of us for the most part. And so inclusive design and inclusive development just simply means that when we write code, let's make sure that that code brings out and is for everybody and the extensive of diversity that exists in this country. And we're very diverse. Latinos are super diverse, super diverse. And so when we think about inclusive development, we also think about intersectionality. Right? So inclusive design means like, let's build an app that a blind person can use, or let's build an app that doesn't speak Spanish for a person who doesn't speak Spanish. But what happens when that person doesn't speak Spanish, doesn't have a bank account, but is also blind? It's a much bigger problem, and we call that intersectionality. Right? And what that means is that sometimes people are different, but they are different in many different ways. Not just one way, multiple ways. And that creates a bigger problem for us as developers. And so that's what intersectionality actually means. So what do you expect to learn today or get from this conversation? Well, the first one is how to engineer or design better apps. I hope that's kind of what we get out of the conversation. The second part is focus on universal audiences, right? How do you build an app that's meant to work here, but that works for everybody, everywhere, anywhere in the world? But also making apps that are approachable, understandable, interactable, and navigable. All right? So if I was to define what a great app is, are these 4 words. If you go anywhere and you ask anybody to define, if somebody comes to you, hey, what is a good app? You should say, an app is approachable. It allows me, it welcomes me, and it accepts me for who I am. An app actually sees me, and I feel seen by this app. An app is understandable. I can navigate through the UI, and I understand what the UI is and what the intent of that UI is. An app is also interactable, meaning I can press the buttons in the app. But what happens if I don't have arms? How do I press those buttons? Right? And so the app has to be interactable whether you have arms or not, right? And lastly, the app has to be navigable. And this is a hard one for a lot of people. Navigation in a 2D system in a digital world is very confusing. It's not how we navigate in the real world, right? You play a video game, it's easy, but an app is complicated because we have flat navigation, hierarchical level navigation, right? And so, but navigation is not just about you pressing a button and go somewhere else, but within that view hierarchy, making sure that a user can actually navigate from the top left corner to the bottom right corner. Do you know why we use top left corners to bottom right corner? There you go. Because we read and write from left to right, top to bottom. Have you ever wondered why we write code from left to right, top to bottom, why computers compile code from left to right, top to bottom? And why object-oriented programming changed the game? Because now we can actually do event handling, right? And so readability. But here's the catch. We don't all read left to right, top to bottom. So what happens when somebody encounters the app and their language, they read right to left, Arabic, or Japanese, right, in straight vertical lines. So are you accounting for that kind of behavior in your apps? So now, here's the good part. We're in a software conference, so let's talk about software. So let's talk about product. What is a product? A product is defined as 3 components. It is the business, It is the UX experience behind the product, and it is the technology that empowers the product. Anywhere you go in tech, we'll tell you that this is how we define products. There's 3 components: business, UX, technology. Assuming that you guys are all software engineers, you guys are in charge of the technology part. My friend over here, she was in charge of the UX component. And then there's somebody somewhere who usually is very detached, far left from the technology part, is in charge of the business. But why does that matter? Because the product has to be a harmonious connection between all 3 entities. So how do we breach the gap? How do we ensure that all these 3 components actually work together? Well, technology, you know it. It's the iOS, it's the Android, it's the cross-platform. Now, I know a lot of you guys out here like that cross-platform situation kind of stuff. I don't. I know, it sounds biased. I'm a big iOS guy. And I know it sounds biased because I kind of work for kind of the company that makes the thing. But it's not biased because I'm not pro-iOS. I'm just against cross-platform. I'm pro-Android development too. And we can talk about that all day long, and you'll see why. So this is the technology piece. And then you have the UX component, which is how it works. It's not the UI, right? A lot of people confuse UX and UI. It is not the UI. It is how it works. And it puts the user's needs first. And I wanted to highlight that part because it's very important to a UX engineer. And it comes the business. And the business is the metrics, the KPI, and the goal. Today, I want to come have a conversation about how you can use these metrics, these KPIs, and goal to better provide for users in a way that you can do so by developing better software. So what are KPIs and metrics? So startups. How many of you guys are interested in startups? Okay, not a lot of interest in startups. Okay, we get in there, we still got time. So one of the biggest startup accelerator in the world called YC, or Y Combinator, they argue that a startup is actually a very fast-growing company. It's different from a small business. A small business you can still have a software company that is a small business, but a startup is actually a very fast-growing company. And usually that metric is measured by number of active users, right? Is how many people do you have in your app? And what defines a startup is based on the goals. So a startup is defined as a 5% week-over-week growth in your number of active users. So that means that if you have a company, you develop some app, and you got some users, you got 100 users today, if you want to be considered a startup, next week you got to have 105 users. Okay? And this kind of growth will compound. It will compound to about 22% month over month and about 12.5 times fold year over year. And this is very important for software companies and investors and accelerators because software is very expensive to build. But once you build it, you can scale it very cheap. So if you right now make a platform in the Dominican Republic that is approachable, understandable, interactable, and navigable, that platform has the intent, it has the capacity to scale to the rest of the world and achieve this level of growth. And this is what big investors are looking for. So when we put it all back together, how do we glue all this stuff? And the way we glue it is through UX engineering. You have a person, a guy, a girl, or anything in between, who's going to be like, I understand the technical side. I understand the user experience and their pain point, and I understand the business need. Every business wants to make money. Right? And I can somehow provide a solution that I can support every team in between. So yeah, I work for Apple, and I'm a accessibility lead software engineer at Apple. But I forgot to mention that I'm actually the CEO of a company that's actually here in the Dominican Republic called Moneda. And what is Moneda, right? So we are a fintech company, and we are a digital payment wallet for the underbanked. Right? So, you know, and I thought it was a very interesting problem that we're trying to solve, right? And what is our vision? So our vision is actually to become the financial infrastructure for the underbanked and the next billion users. Here's what happened. Here's why I started this company. I came to the Dominican Republic for vacation. I was like, I work at Apple. I get paid. I can buy things here, and I can buy this, and I can buy that, only to find out that, yes, I technically could, I just couldn't pay the person I was buying it from. And I thought there was an issue there. I was, okay, how come I can't pay this person? So I was like, maybe it's because I don't have a bank account. So maybe if I get a bank account locally, I'll be able to pay this person. And so I went to El Popular, y Reserva, y BH de León, and a year and a half later, they still don't want to give me a bank account. And they asked me, give me the last 3 pay stubs of your job, which I did, right? I was like, here's my last 3 pay stub, which I thought it was super weird. And then they asked me to give them an employment letter from my employer. So I brought all this stuff. The letter was in English. They're like, oh, you got to get it notarized by a lawyer in Spanish. It's like, but I told you I work for an American company. And so I went and got it notarized by a lawyer in Spanish, and then they still wouldn't give me a bank account. I hired a lawyer to help me open a bank account. And she went in there, she did her thing, she was a woman, and she still couldn't get the bank account open. They argue that because I'm a dual citizen, that I needed to bring a copy of this social security card, which is not your ID, but this weird number that America gives you that you don't ever use it. And you leave it at home in the cabinet, and you use the number, and you give the number to people, but you don't bring the physical card ever. Here, they're asking me for the physical card. And I said to myself, damn, like if I'm an engineer, I come from America, and I'm struggling to open a bank account, I can only imagine the lady that's cooking for me at home. And so I decided to ask her if she had a bank account, and she didn't. And I was like, how come? And I realized that a lot of people didn't have bank accounts. And I started taking Ubers for fun to find out whether my Uber drivers had bank accounts. And they didn't. And they didn't. It was super crazy because I asked them, and 80% of them didn't have a bank account. And when I asked them, how did they get paid through Uber, they say things like, oh, I got my cousin's bank account linked up. Or I got my aunt's, or my brother, or my best friend. And to me, it was crazy that the situation was so extreme that you will override privacy and security to give your hard-earned money to somebody else just so that you can make money. Go ahead. Yes. Yep, and you'll see where we're going with this. So purchase. When we think about digital payments, most company in the fintech space think about digital payment in the instance of payment. Now that you have the conversion, how do you switch over to get this customer? And then think about, well, you're already here. Then think about the tender, card, credit card, loan, whatever. That's not how we think about digital payment. We think about purchase as a purchase exchange, and it has 3 stages: pre-purchase, purchase, and post-purchase. And what a lot of people miss is that before the purchase is the consideration set. Most people don't make it that far. So if we're making a business, most fintech company in Dominican Republic, here's how they work. They said, we're going to address the market in the Dominican Republic, 11 million people. We're going to give access to a digital transaction company to these people to improve their banking experience. All of them are depending on banking. That means that 42% of the country, only 42% of the country have access to bank accounts. That means that they're addressing a market of only 4,620,000 people. And then they forget about the fact that 1 out of 7 people have a disability. And not only do they not think about inclusion from a banking perspective, but they also don't think about accessibility. And when they do the math, now they're left with only 3,160,000 people. Because now people who are with disability can't even use the app to begin with. And then they also forget about the people who don't speak Spanish, like Haitians. And then they also forget about people with different kind of ranges of ages. And they also forget about people with digital literacy, people who never held a smartphone in their hands. And then they forget about people and discrimination and sex and religion and ethnicity and race. And so when you actually go about targeting this market, how much people do you actually have left to actually use your app? It's a big problem, and I just couldn't get my head around there. And so when we think about that, we said, okay, what is the opportunity there? And can we do something differently? And so we said, okay, well, if we design an app that works for every disability person in the country, then now we have an app that is inclusive. If we design an app that doesn't require you to speak Spanish, then we're also designing an app that's inclusive. If we design an app that doesn't require you to ever have touched a smartphone in your hand ever before, then we're designing an app that's inclusive. And if we design an app that will prevent any form of discrimination, because these kind of identifiers truly don't matter, what if we just design an app that just welcomes all these things? We call that intersectionality. And when we think about intersectionality, we're able to address a different market. Instead of addressing the 42% of people that do have access to banking, what we do at Moneda is that we're addressing the people that don't have access to banking. And that's actually about 50% of the population. Now, that gives us a much larger number. And because we put in the work to actually feed accessibility into the development process and the design, our number doesn't trickle down by any of those factors that involves identity or any kind of personal identifiers. So we have a much more bigger addressable market. But what's even more important is that we can now say, now we can target even just 0.5% of those people. And if we do that, our opportunity is that we can get a target of 31,000 people in our first year. And when we follow the natural growth of Airbnb and other tech company, we know that after the second year, that user base can grow to 390,000. And by the time we hit the third year, we're already hitting half of the country. And you know what we do after that? We're ready to get out of the Dominican Republic and go to the next country. Because by the fifth year, we will already exceed the total market cap in the Dominican Republic by simply making an app more accessible. But you guys are all software developers, right? So like, how do we do that with code? Here's the problem that we're targeting. 53% of the population in the Dominican Republic don't have access to banking or banking services. 38% globally, by the way. And they're all becoming online for the first time. They never had a smartphone in their hands. So how do we design an app that solves that problem? All right? So quick facts, 1 billion people in the world have a disability. Permanent, situational, temporary, Black and Latino, meaning us. We have about trillions of dollars worth of purchasing power. And Gen Zers, meaning us and the people after us, they tend to allocate their investments with companies and brands that align with their moral and ethical beliefs. These people, we like to call them the new ROI, or return of influence. Because if we can treat them very good, they'll put up a video on TikTok and make us go viral. So now, doing this with code, here's some background knowledge. I want you to get the tools first to be able to solve this problem. Here are all the dimensions of diversity: physical, race, gender, geography, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, language, sexual orientation, religion, age, culture, disability, and experience in censoring. Some users might have one, some users might have two, some users might have all of them. So you have to think about that. Next billion users. I'll tell you that Moneda mission is actually to become the financial infrastructure for the underbanked and the next billion users. Google defined this term for us. And what Google did a very phenomenal research, and they said that right now, today, there's 1 billion people getting online for the first time. And they said that it is very unique about this problem because it's a huge market opportunity for any of one of us, but they come with very unique set of characteristics. These people lack digital literacy. They have a cost barrier. They have a connectivity barrier. And they have literacy barrier, meaning reading and writing and doing gestures with your phone. Completely different. All right, so how do we do this? Here is what onboarding looks like. Every great app should have an onboarding experience. And how many of you guys seen apps to have this kind of onboarding experience? Yeah, it should be everybody, right? This is called the onboarding framework. It has 3 components. It has the value proposition, addressing concerns, and call to action. It's something that we use very heavily in mainstream markets, right? There's some problems with this. Can anybody know what the problem with this is? Here's some UX. Well, there's a call to action that gets you into the platform. That call to action is very far, far away from a user that never had a smartphone before. In order for you to get to that call to action, you have to know how to swipe. I don't know how many of you guys grew up in a swiping environment, but I know I didn't. And so the first time I swiped anything was on a smartphone. And so also, there's a lot of words in here. Like quite a lot of words. And if I don't know how to read, that's a problem, right? It almost seems like I'm almost dependent on what I'm reading. Also, there's a lot of colors. And there's a lot of us that are colorblind, and they can see that, right? And so that's a problem, right? There's a lot of text, and it takes a lot physical labor to get to the call to action. But when we finally get through, and congratulations if you have been able to get through this stuff, you're quite a part of the few, you're met with this, right? And then like, there's one problem here. Anybody know what the problem here is? It's just in this frame. What is sign up? If I never had a smartphone before, what is sign up? And what is sign in? And what's the difference between the two? And if I don't know neither, which one do I choose? You know, one of my designers, he had an interview at Disney, and they asked him, well, if you're a fintech company, how come you spend so much time in this onboarding experience? Shouldn't you be focused on improving the experience and actually making a transaction? And when he came to me and told me, I said, do you know the reason why? And he kind of figured it out. I said, because this person will never get a chance to make the transaction if they cannot make an account in the app. So the most important part of the app has to be onboarding, right? It's like, can we actually get them to get to the app first? And then we focus on whether or not they can make a transaction later. And then when you choose one of these, once you figure that out, then you're met with like 20 options. And it's like, which one do I choose? And actually, the option for when you click one button or the other is actually the same set of options. And if you ever done any kind of third-party authentication, you kind of will realize that what happens on the back end is also almost the same. But why do we differentiate that? So here's what we did at Moneda. We went hard at work, and we figured out how can we prevent people from going through this whole journey to get into the platform? How can we make onboarding an option? So we figured, well, can we educate people in the same page we ask them to click the button? Can we make that casserole scroll automatically so it doesn't depend on them actually swiping through them? And can we make the call to action just one button? So there's no choice. Therefore, there's no failure. There's only one way to move forward, right? And we did that. And all we did was like, well, can we just ask them for their phone number? And once we get their phone number, we can figure out whether they have an account or not. And so we no longer depend on the user to make the decision to sign up or sign in because we have their data in their backend. If they give us their phone number, if we have it, great, sign in. If we don't have it, let's make an account. And so what we do was that we just ask them for their phone number. And then we ask them to authenticate. And then we literally show them a sign in or a sign up screen after they give us their number. But we make that distinction. We know they want to get in there. We know the ways to get in. And so how do we do that with code? How many of you guys know Firebase? Great framework, right? Great API, SDK for authenticating users, third-party authentication. We don't use Facebook sign-in or whatever. Anybody knows why? Yeah, exactly. Remember the talk is UX engineering, equity, and inclusion in an emerging market? Well, guess what? People are not guaranteed to have emails. So we conducted a study, and what we did realize is that people are all using WhatsApp. So we figure out if we were to have one piece of information that we can guarantee that anybody can log into, what would that be? So, well, they use WhatsApp every day. So let's use their phone number. So we did that. And so we figure out we'll get rid of all the Facebook, Instagram, and whatever third-party authentication, and then we use phone authentication through Firebase. And sure enough, we start the authentication process. We call in the API. We take their phone number. We send it to Firebase. Firebase come back. We get a verification code. We get that verification code from Firebase, right? Because now all we have to guarantee is that the phone that they have is the one in their hands, right? So they put in their verification code. We authenticate with Firebase. Firebase tells us, yes, this phone is in their hand, is a great users. All right. Moving along. And then we do some little back-end infrastructure, right? There's more to do than there, because now you have to figure out, now that you have authenticated their phone number, do they have an account with you or not? And so Firebase has the Firebase admin SDK that you can use in the cloud function. And so we do some other cool stuff in the back end to call our own APIs and say, hey, does this person have an account with us? And then the API comes back and say, yes, here's the user ID, or no, it doesn't, let's create a new account. How we do that is pretty cool, and I don't know how many of you guys know about what we're about to do next and how we did that. But one of the things I want to show you is localization. Very important. Most people write their app in a biased language, like English, or maybe to you in Spanish, and that's a big problem. Biggest country for tourism. There's more people in this country than Spanish speaking. Don't write your app in Spanish, all right? Here's what typical localization looks like on any app that I see locally. They have some sort of variable, they put in a string, they literally type in the physical string in there, and it gives me a headache every time I see it. And then they put in a button, and they type in the physical string for the button. And it's a terrible way to do it. It doesn't scale. It doesn't scale at all. And every time you want to change that, you got to push an update. And I'm going to tell you why updates are bad. And so it's very easy to do this in iOS. It's like 2 clicks. The first click is you go to your app, you go to your app target and info, and you just explicitly say, hey, I want to actually have my app available in Spanish, English, and by the way, we are launching in Creole. In Creole, right? And it's like super easy, just click a button. And then the platform does everything else for you. And so now you're left with 2 string files, we call them string files, in which you put in your Spanish localization and your whatever language alternative is. And they require you to have a base language. And so now we can have an app that is in Spanish, English, and Creole. And now any user who speaks any language will be able to actually change into any of those. And so what does that look like? So once you do that, you do have to do a slight change to the actual string formatting, and you have to call a new API called localized string key. And now you can pass in the key of your actual string file. And now you can localize it to any supported language on iOS. And this is much better. Not the best, though. Here's a much better to do it. Instead of having any language dependency, can we remove the language dependency all whatsoever from the actual app? Let's eliminate our biases, right? Check your bias. Just because you speak English, you don't have to write an app in English, right? So we can actually write the language of the app in pseudocode, and we can create keys. And actually, our wonderful localization girl over here, Sarah, she does this for us. And so she writes the keys for our app. So when developers are writing the strings for any label and button, we don't write or use words, we use keys. And then we have Sarah find some very good people who speak Spanish and translate the text and the context in Spanish. And then she finds somebody who speaks English and Creole and so forward. And then we put that somehow in a server in the back end, and then we do some manipulation, turn it into a JSON file, right, or JSON object. And now we can now come back and said, during your configuration time in your app, you can call your get localization, right? The problem with the second iteration in the top is that every localization exists in the code base in the client side. Not good. Data is very expensive in emerging markets, and you want to reduce the size of the app as much as you can. Okay? And so with that being said, if we were to support every language with the second iteration, you would have to house every translation in the app, which is not a good thing. So thinking with equity is saying, well, let's not make this person pay for something they're not going to use. So what you do, again, make your JSON object. You make a configuration manager. You call your getTranslation object. Download only the translation that you need for that one user. The beautiful part about this is that you can also update the translation anytime and don't have to redeploy the app, which means less data. Less data is good in Dominican Republic. Very expensive. Data, almost food money, right? And so that is the much better way to do it. And so this is what it looks like. You go into your actual app, and now you create an enum just based out of your keys. Much lightweight than your actual string-based objects that you were building before. And then you make a function that calls your translation manager, and you send in the key, and it returns the appropriate localization for the user that's actually using the app. The first one, very bad. The second one, inclusive, but the third one is equitable. Who understands equity much better now? And so that's what I want people to think about when you're developing. It sounds minute and insignificant, but it makes a huge impact to people, especially those that sometimes have to sacrifice a meal to buy el paquetico. And we laugh, and I want you to laugh, but I actually want you to recognize that. I want you to recognize that people who are hopping on the internet for the first time don't have the luxury of data. So preserve that and be mindful of that and write your code to reduce that dependency. So here's the much better way of doing localization, and there's not a single string in that. Connectivity. There's the big one. Data is limited. 250 megabytes per month, the average user. $1 an app, that's a whole meal for even a family in the morning, right? Consider data during installation, usage, update, uninstallation, and background services. Where am I going with this? REST APIs. Who's familiar with REST APIs over here? Who knows a better alternative to REST API today? Ah, I like it. I like it. All right. So we all know how REST API works, right? We have multiple requests to just get a bunch of set of data, right? And so you have to have a lot of communications and a whole bunch of requests. Now, there's no guarantee that you're going to have the same bandwidth and internet from the first request that you have on the second request, or vice versa, right? So if you're doing any kind of process or task that require multiple requests in some sort of chronological sequential order, there's no guarantee that all of this stuff is going to finish, right? And so, but also you have multiple endpoints. So it's super complicated. Overfetching. You have this relationship-based database, and then you just want this user ID. And now you're left with the guy's social security number, right? Like, it's overfetching. Overfetching is bad because, again, these people are paying for this data. Very expensive. So we have GraphQL. So at Moneda, we actually use GraphQL. One of our lead engineers, who is an equity engineer at Facebook, where GraphQL was designed. And so he came in and said, hey, you know, as an equity engineer, I think we should consider using GraphQL because of its multiple benefits. The first benefit, no overfetching. Great. We can actually handle all that stuff in the back end and actually design queries that actually only going to give us the data that we actually need. And that was very important because we do that during sign-in. We have the person's account. So what we do with Firebase is that we authenticate the user with Firebase. And then when we put in the PIN code of their account, we simply send in the PIN code and only get returned the UID. So when the user logs in, we don't return any other kind of personal information from the user unless we absolutely have to. If we weren't using GraphQL, we would have to return the entire object. Right? A little more legwork to do on the back end, right? But it's a much better solution for the end user, right, to eliminate overfetching. What's really good is that GraphQL is also a strong type system. This is very important because it eliminates the need for you to start going through data structures that you're going to mess up. Right? And it happens all the time. It happens to me. Right? Sometimes we have to rely on scripts that we still have to write ourselves. Right? But with GraphQL, it's a strong type language, and you can determine what these types are ahead of the game so that you can handle that better on the client side. You take the schema, put it in your app, bring in your network manager. This is literally, I swear to you, this is almost like the 2 lines of code you had to implement to put in GraphQL. Now, we don't do it like this. We want to be a little more secure, so we make it a little more complicated by actually adding a tokenization system. What we do is that we want to make sure that every request that comes from GraphQL is actually authorized to make that request. We just want to make sure that the user data, if we're requesting data from the server, that is authenticated and is going to the right place. So we do a token intersection process that allows us to take the Firebase token and actually inject it into the Apollo query, GraphQL query as a header, and then we get that on the server side. And we're able to then return whatever the object is. And that's kind of what it looks like. Again, a little more complicated, probably a few more hours to implement just to get the tokenization system to be able to connect both Firebase and GraphQL, Apollo, and all the different frameworks. But at the end of the day, it's a much, much better secure experience for the end user, and it builds equity into your app. So here's how it works. To log in on Moneda, all we do is call our network manager. We said, hey, do we have a user ID? If we have that user ID from Firebase Authentication, we call the Apollo fetching the query. We send the user ID to the query. And by the way, it's the same endpoint. It doesn't change, which is great. You can implement any query you want or mutations, but it's the same endpoint. And then we get a result, success or failure. If the user matches, we get return. We literally just ask the database, hey, just give us their PIN. We match the PIN with the PIN that the user just gave us. And if it does match, well, guess what? You have an account with us. Let's spend some money. So that's how we integrate a lot of different opportunities on equity and inclusion into our code base. But that's not the end. We do a lot more than just that. What we're proposing is that you can be totally blind and still make an account with Moneda. Moneda, we have 2 core philosophies. The first one is inclusive design. Tomamos decisiones que tienen en cuenta los identificadores personales, and we have a focus in equity, which means that we design product for people who have been historically marginalized or underrepresented. Our mission is to build prosperity tools for financial growth. We want people to grow financially from using our tools. Did you know that all households in the Dominican Republic are spending 15% of their total income in solely transportation? You know why? Because in order for them to pay their electric bill and their water and their utilities, they have to take public transportation, spend an hour in traffic, 2 hours on the line, an hour to come back. They're spending money to simply consume basic needs that they need to survive. Things that all can be saved if they simply were able to pay digitally. Our vision, which I shared with you earlier, is to become the financial infrastructure for the underbanked and the next billion users. Thank you. Now I'm going to take any questions that you guys had. If you're interested in following us on Instagram, here's our QR code. Our website is there. If you want to join our beta testing that starts tomorrow, you're able to sign up through our website and our Instagram account as well. And I'm ready for some questions if you guys have any. Thank you. Yeah. So so the UI is already built, right? So the UX designers and the UI designers are saying, okay, here's what the app should look like and how it should work, right? That's independent of the string in there. Right? How you accommodate the string within the space is all based on us, right? One thing that I mentioned today that we do is something called dynamic type. In any mobile platform, you are able to enlarge the text of the actual platform, right? And sometimes those texts are too large and they're truncate. So you as a developer has to make sure that when you write the code, that you're actually wrapping your text within the button space. And that the button is enlarging. So if the text is larger, the button should enlarge with it, right? You don't have to change anything on the code base, because if you really just want to change the string, you just change it on the server side. So you just, again, you go to the JSON file and change the value of that string to whatever your new found system is. But ideally, you should never be presented with a situation where the label, the size of a text should implicate the design of the UI. And a button is a very UI-driven concept that's also backed up by UX, if that makes sense. So.
Why native?
Why native? Yeah, good stuff. Thank you. Oh, I forgot how to demo. I only have 5 minutes, so I won't show you the demo. Why native? Well, because two things. We have a lot of frameworks and tools that you can access to that you don't have access to on a cross-platform perspective. There's a lot of, for example, accessibility. All the frameworks that you can use to audit your app for accessibility exist natively in Xcode. And so you can run your app natively, but if you're going to look into memory leak, performance, battery consumption, and all this very critical stuff, because people with these smartphones, they're not the newest smartphones. Their batteries are dying halfway through the day. And so when you are doing cross-platform, you are taking so much resource from the operating system to the whole conversion layer that if you were to just run natively, you will have a much faster processing platform and able to access the native tool that comes from the operating system, like accessibility, usability stuff, but also pretty cool framework from machine learning, right? One of the things that we do in Moneda is that, how many of you guys, we know that sometimes you open an app and it's in whatever language and you happen to figure it out. Like what we learned was that people in WhatsApp are able to use WhatsApp even if they don't know how to read, right? And they just like send the mic button to talk, and we learned that behavior, right? And we were trying to figure out why would people just use that behavior. And what we realized was that what happens is that some people just learn how to use app based on where things are, right? Which is great UX. And so when you send money, you know how you have the note in the box? What we do is that when you send notes to people, we keep track of the language in which you're writing it. And if after a long time we realize that the language in which you're sending notes on your money sending stuff is not that of the native app, we tell you, we recognize that. Say, hey, we realize that you're speaking in this language, but the app is in a completely different language. Do you want us to do the switch for you? Right? And we're able to do that because we're able to access natural language processing framework directly from iOS. And we're able to implement that like in a second and be able to get an instant response from the system to be able to do that and support the user from an actual natural language perspective. So two things. First of all, I want to eliminate the use of the word of third world country. We're not third in anything, right? So just to begin with, we are an emerging market, right? And I think that's the better phrase is understanding that we are a country that is becoming something, right? And so this is not a race to begin with, right? So we're not third. Two, yes, we do have some trouble entering the market, right? One of them is like partnering with banks, right? Their system is very outdated. And for example, in America, we have something called like Stripe. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Stripe. We don't have Stripe here, right? And that makes the job very difficult for us. So we have to rely on other things like machine learning to be able to have agents that allows people to exchange their money. And sometimes some of those agents might not have banks. And so we use data to be able to remove the liability of how we move money around. If money is not being housed in an actual bank account, right? It would be great if banks will immediately work with us, but that took some friction, right? I think that talent is growing, is not quite there yet, right? Our hope is to hire people locally and for people to understand these things. But it's very important that for us to build great products in DR, you need to know what equity is and inclusion, because most of the people in this country fall under that category.
Por ejemplo, hay dos cosas que utiliza la aplicación, que es el número de teléfono. ¿Tú has considerado, y te lo digo porque, por ejemplo, yo vivo como en el countryside de la ciudad, ¿tú has considerado a esta gente que cada 2 semanas cambian de número de teléfono?
Yes, we have actually, and we have a very cool actually account recovery process. One of the challenges that we had was, well, if you don't have a phone number or an email, how do you recover your account? We can talk that offline. I can show you what that looks like. It's super cool. We actually learned that from WeChat in China. Thank you.